Okay. So I'm just gonna ask you guys to just, as you join in, just go to menti.com and type in that code that you see at the top of the screen. Right? We're just doing our pre-lecture check-in right now, so I want to see some responses. Right? How are you feeling before we head into this entire debacle? Right? So yeah, so in the interest of time, we'll just move on. But please remember to just type in that. That's how we're gonna be communicating, right? As I said to the persons that are just coming in, there are questions, there are polls, there are chats, right? That are going to be throughout this entire thing, right? So I want you guys to be able to participate in that. So you just have to just join at menti.com. I'm gonna resend the link in the chat, right? So you can just join there and you'll be able to just, participate, right? So I want you guys to participate. This is to increase inclusion. All right. So let's go. So we're seeing some general words that way. I don't know why people are just writing Caribbean and studies and sleepy and behind and whatever. And could you guys just do me a favor? Just if I ask you to resend the code in the chat, just resend the code in the chat for persons who are joining. But yeah, so good evening everyone. Welcome back to Caribbean Studies. We're going to be looking at the West African migration to the Caribbean, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of indentureship just upon the introduction of the peasantry system, right? Upon the, what happens with the peasantry thereabout. So we're going to be looking at this. I want you guys to just join here so you'll be able to participate in discussions and everything, all right? Now, what are we going to be looking at, right? So what comes to mind when you hear transatlantic slavery? So you guys should be able to see this come up on your feed. So I want to see what comes to mind when you hear transatlantic slavery. Just let me know. Just type in the words. Let's see them come up. Let's see what's on your minds as it relates to transatlantic slavery. What comes to mind?
What was your question?
Oh, what comes to mind when you hear transatlantic slavery? Can you see my screen?
Okay, I can see it now.
All right. So I'm just asking you guys to just type in that code at menti.com so you guys can participate in these things, right? So see them coming up. All right, if you want to talk, you can talk because I noticed that when it's really late, some persons don't have the liberty to just talk, right? So this is why I implemented this so you guys can, just participate for the person who can't talk. But if you want to talk, you talk because I want you guys to talk and have conversations because Cameron says it's mainly about discussions, right? So let's see what comes to mind. So some persons are middle, I guess the middle passage, right? Oppression, traveling, indentured, selling of slaves, the enslaved, actually. So we're gonna correct that vocabulary. We refer to them as the enslaved. They are not born slaves. They are not slaves in their own right. No one is a slave in their own right. Therefore, we describe them as enslaved persons, right? Across as well. Okay. Let me resend the link in the chat. Can somebody just resend the link in the chat, please? So you guys can have everything there. I think I'm able to resend it now. So there it is. All right. Oppression. All right. So we're just looking at these different things. So when we talk about transatlantic slavery, I'm going to send you guys some videos as well in the WhatsApp group. So when we talk about transatlantic slavery, we're talking about the interaction with the Atlantic world and West Africa just after around 1520, the 1520s, 1530s, after the entire genocide of the Indians, right? We left off speaking about um what happened to the Indians. We left off speaking about the repartimiento system, the encomienda system, and how these things affected the indigenous populations negatively, right? And we're looking at basically the Spanish monopoly and what monopoly they had over the Caribbean and what they were doing within the Caribbean region at the time. So we're around the 1500s thereabout now, right? The Portuguese has sailed to West Africa. The Portuguese were the first to begin West African slavery, right? In a transatlantic type of way, right? And then the Spanish were the ones who actually went in now and made it a big thing. So we spoke about the fact that the indigenous population was severely decreased, right? After the encomienda and the repartimiento system and the abuse of these systems by the encomenderos and by the conquistadors, right? We also would have spoken about the fact that they were looking for other persons. We're gonna talk about why, right? And we're gonna talk about the defender of the Indians and stuff like that, right? We're gonna talk about them. So I want you guys to bring up the different concepts that you have. Does anybody have any other concepts about the transatlantic slavery that comes to mind? Anybody want to drop in anything? What do we remember about transatlantic slavery?
So sir, it has to do with that the Atlantic, the triangle system. We call it again where the slaves came from West Africa to the Caribbean,
Triangular trade?
goods went back to Europe, and then from Europe to Africa. So it's a triangle thing.
Triangle trade. All right. So let's have a look at this then. So before we start specifically, right? I want to so you guys feel about the topic, right? So how do we feel about the topic? Just choose one of these options here, right? So yeah, so we have some information about the topic. Some persons already know what transatlantic slavery really is. Some persons don't really know. Some persons have an idea. Some persons did it in CSEC history, and since them do CSEC history, they didn't never want to do it ever again. So they just stopped doing history. Some people are doing history in one right now. Some people have done history in one and moved on to history in it two. So some persons, we have varying levels of knowledge and information about the topic. All right. So, as you were saying, right, the person who spoke, as you were saying, right, we're speaking about the triangular trade. Triangular trade has something to do with it, right? The fact that guns and different types of cloths and etc. were exported from Europe towards West Africa, and then from West Africa to the New World, there were things like ivory, etc. Especially the enslaved that were exported to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and North America, and then those persons were placed into this agricultural system, this agrarian system, in order to create a surplus of sugarcane, logwood, mahogany, right? These different types of stuff, different types of production. Tobacco plantations were really important to Virginian economies, right? Tobacco plantations were important to the colonies in Cuba, in Jamaica, etc. before sugarcane was implemented. So we're looking at the fact that they were used as a system of production for these raw materials that were sent back to Europe for use in Europe, right? So I'm seeing that we have some knowledge of the topic. Four persons answered so far, right? I want to see more persons. Let me just resend the link real quick. All right, so you guys can just use that link to participate in the polls, right? And they're going to be polls that I actually want everybody to participate in. So we're just gonna have to focus, all right? So yeah. So how do we feel about the topic? I think majority of persons would be somewhat knowledgeable about the topic and will be able to move on. All right. So let's just dive into it, all right? In interest of time, let's just dive into it. All right. So West African migration to the Caribbean. So let's start with that. Now, why do you think we chose West African specifically? Why them choose West African specifically? Somebody speak to me. Why them choose West African specifically? The persons who can't talk, you guys can write, right? Persons who can talk, talk to me. Why?
I think because slavery was already occurring in West Africa at the time,
All
like
right.
within the different tribes.
hmm So we're saying that slavery was easily justifiable, because it existed in West Africa. Okay, would we say that this is the same type of slavery that existed in West Africa?
No, well, not really.
So what type of slavery existed in West Africa before the transatlantic slave trade? What type? If nobody goes, I'll go in. Anybody has any idea of what type of slavery occurred there? All right. So the major difference between West African slavery, well, our slavery indigenous to the West African region, and transatlantic slavery is that transatlantic slavery is most definitely chattel slavery. And chattel speaks to some amount of property that you can own. That is similar to the West African system, but it's strictly different in the sense that West Africans, right, they use slavery as a form of punishment, right? So what we're saying is that let's say that you committed a specific crime, right? You had to work for a specific family or work for a specific person, right, until your debts were paid, right? It's the same thing that occurred within the New World before the Europeans came. It happened in the Maya civilization, it happened in the Aztec civilization, it happened in China, it happened in Rome, it happened in all sorts of ancient civilizations that we've seen before. And yes, it did happen within West African society. Right? So slavery was a type of punishment, right? But it was not permanent. And slaves had to be treated based on laws within the different societies, right? So I'm seeing that, right? So it is easily justifiable. Some they use it to justify the fact that they can enslave West Africans because West African slavery existed, right? But we have to really make the distinction that West African slavery was nothing compared to the turmoil that was transatlantic slavery, right? So why them choose West Africans as the people having strong people? All right, so it is a major misconception that okay, scientifically, right, we are not that different, right? So persons of West African descent are not that different from persons of European descent. But based on the fact that they have melanated skin, based on the fact that they have worked within the same temperature zone, right? They worked in the tropics, right? So it's around the equator. The Caribbean and West Africa are around the same temperature, right? So they're saying that these persons are more adapted and will last longer. They would be more durable within the Caribbean sun, right? Working in these fields, working in an agricultural setting. So, in some way, we can say that they were stronger people in that sense, right? So, somebody said that Africans were tricked. What do we mean by that? Could somebody expound on that? What do you mean they were tricked? Anyone? What do we mean by they were tricked? 'Cause I see that on the screen, so I have to ask. Anybody would like to explain that?
So I believe that
Mm-hmm.
they were tricked in the sense that the well, this is my belief. Yeah, so what Victoria said. So what happened is that I believe that when the Europeans came to Africans, they made some kind of deals with the African leaders because they had rivaling tribes. So they make some kind of deals, and those tribes or whatever tribe leader, whatever, tell the people them say, "Oh, Ray, oh no, go down so now get a better life, etc., etc., etc." But when them go up on the ship now, them realize say, "Yo, we can't go in a better life still with shackle like this and under this a condition." So essentially, the general belief, what most people believe was that they were tricked into coming to the new world.
All right.
Some were forcefully, loaded onto the ship, but the majority was tricked.
Okay. All right, so I understand that standpoint. I understand that standpoint, right? But all right, okay, let's just take that. All right, so we have the. Go ahead. I think somebody raised their hand.
Yes,
hmm
could you repeat the question you asked, please?
Oh, I was saying that somebody has the Africans were tricked on the screen, so I wanted somebody to expound on that. What do we mean by that?
Okay, I didn't think, this is my opinion though, I didn't think they were tricked. Because slavery was already there. I think that the Europeans made deals with the slave masters,
hmm
like to trade the men for material like clothing and other things to help them. So because slavery already existed and they were slaving the persons, the slaves were traded to the Americas. That's what I believe
All
for
right.
materials.
Okay, so it's a part of the triangular trade type of argument. Okay. All right. Okay, I understand what you're saying. So some persons believe that they were tricked, right? I think I am free to agree and disagree with different standpoints, right? So slavery was used as a type of punishment, right? A type of punishment for crimes. So what tend to happen within West African societies is that Europeans came to West Africa in a type of mindset that they could go in and they could control swaths of land and just take away the persons and then just carry them to the new world, right? Or to the Caribbean in this sense, right? They soon they shortly found out that they could not do that in West African societies. The West African terrain was too terrible for them specifically, right? I wouldn't say terrible, it was hard for them to navigate, right? West African societies specifically, right, knew their terrain well, while the Europeans did not, right? As well as the abundances of different types of some persons would argue that there were diseases and those type of stuff that the Europeans could not actually tend with, etc., right? That made it kind of hard for Europeans to actually strike deep into West Africa, right? So what they tend to do now is use persons that we call middlemen, right? They used to use middlemen, right, to actually form armed groups to go in and steal persons and capture persons from different tribes and carry them to the coast to hold them in what we call barracoons, these cages, right, until the Europeans will come for them, right? After a while, this middleman paradigm actually degraded, right? And the West Africans actually started to make, agreements, right, with the Europeans. Now, listen this, all right? Transatlantic slavery is a mainly economic system, right? It's for profit, right? It is capitalism, right? So, on understanding this type of dynamic, no, right? The West Africans made deals with the Europeans to sell the slaves, right? Or to trade the slaves for their goods, for gunpowder, etc. Right? So what we have developing is what we call slave kingdoms. Right? So we talk about Dahomey and Oyo and Ashanti and these different types of kingdoms, right? They were built on slave trade. They got their wealth through trading slaves and stuff like that, right? And what we realize is that these European nations continue to trade with persons who would give them the most slaves. So what did the African kings do? What did the tribalists do? They made slavery a crime, or well, not a crime. They made slavery a punishment for almost everything. So when slavery was actually the most gruesome punishment, slavery started to become a commonplace punishment to justify, right, selling more and more Africans into slavery, into transatlantic slavery, so they could get more goods. And after a while, they actually started selling slaves for gold. Well, not for gold. They had gold in abundance. They started to trade slaves for gunpowder, etc. Right, to build their arsenal, right, to build their military, so they could attack other tribes and other kingdoms. Notice, a lot of us try to use the word tribes to try to water down West African societies. West African societies were some of the most powerful societies in human history, right? So they were really powerful. So they got really powerful based off of trading, right? And they actually started to destroy other types of other smaller tribes, other smaller groups, other smaller kingdoms, and sell all those prisoners of war in slavery, right? So we had dynamics like this, and this was to fuel the increase in wealth, right? It was a capitalist system, right? In which the means of production were the Africans themselves, right? Being owned by the Europeans. Okay? Make sense? Hopefully everything that makes sense. Right? So we have something like that. All right. Remember, if you have anything to chip in, you just raise your hand and you go ahead. All right, and not stopping anybody from sharing their opinions. Okay. Right? Cheap labor specifically, we need to fix that on the screen. It's not cheap labor, it was like just labor, right? They were not paid, so it's not like it was cheap labor, it was free labor, right? So exactly, free workers. Okay, and then we had the perception that West Africans were somehow superhuman, that they felt less pain, etc. Right? These different paradigms actually led into, a lot of different types of, racist agendas against persons of West African descent, right? Because how are you going to justify that West Africans feel less pain than regular persons? Are you trying? The thing is, no, this is what we call othering, right? I'm going to bring in a lot of concepts and stuff like that, by the way. This is what we call othering, right? In order to justify your complete control and subjugation and dehumanization of a people, you try to do what we call othering, meaning making that group other than you. So you try to say that, okay, these persons are larger, so they're different from us. These persons feel less pain, so they are completely different from us. These persons have a different skin color, so they are different from us. So they're making the West Africans other. They're making them different from themselves, right? In order to justify subjugating them and thinking them of lesser as lesser, right? So you have many different reasons why they chose West Africans. So we're speaking about the climate specifically. We're speaking about the fact that they were easily accessible due to corruption within West African nations, right? We're looking at the fact that cheap labor, right? Well, free labor per se, right? They were relatively close, right, to the Caribbean, right? Just across the Atlantic Ocean, around the Middle Passage thereabouts. Okay, so let's just have a look here. Hope I'm not skipping anything. All right. Okay, so why slavery specifically? Now, just to go through this, slavery emerged, right, as a response to the labor vacuum created by the genocide of the Amerindians that I spoke about, right? With the African diaspora subsequently filling that void. So the Amerindians employed the repartimiento and the encomienda labor systems, while Africans were subjugated to the slavery labor system and an agricultural business model, right? So it was an agricultural business model. That is what slavery is, right? A capitalist structure based in an agrarian society. That is what slavery is, right? Using persons, dehumanizing them, using them as actual property. So this is called chattel slavery, specifically. The utilization of slavery served to propel imperialistic ambitions, allowing Europeans to maximize their financial gains. Slavery and the plantation system were integral components of capitalist economic structures, characterized by a relentless pursuit of profit within the economic framework, right? Specifically, labor was commodified, purchased until death, rather than compensated through regular payment of services, right? So we're looking at that. They were not paid specifically, right? Labor was commodified, so it was just something that they had to do, right? The enslaved persons were purchased as well, and they were owned until death. And we already know that persons who were born on the plantation per se were born into slavery as well. So it's something that you had to do your entire life. There was no getting out of it, right? There was no pay, nothing like that, right? Persons who did Caribbean history would have realized that you had things like provision grounds that they allowed for them, right? So provision grounds were some plots of land that the slaves could, actually farm themselves. And the reason why they got provision grounds is because it was too expensive for the plantation owners to feed the enslaved themselves. So they just gave them a plot of land and told them to go and farm for themselves, right? So that's what provision grounds were, right? And the enslaved persons usually had one suit of clothing thereabout or no clothing at all, right? It was actually, um, what would you say, ameliorated by the laws of Burgos and stuff like that. But I don't think we'll go that deep in Caribbean studies, okay? The slaves also lived around what we call pigsties and different types of pigsties, animal dwellings, and stuff like that. So when you hear things about, for example, I'm not sure about other areas within the Caribbean, but we hear areas like May Pen, Christian Pen, anything with pen in the name, right, and stuff like that, and Ville in the name. These were areas in which animals were usually reared, and enslaved persons usually lived around those areas, right? So they created large amounts of enslaved populations, and those places tend to become population centers within Caribbean colonies, right? So there are multiple different areas that we could see, and we're going to see the formation of free villages, etc. when we start talking about the movement towards emancipation, right? If there's anything to add, you guys can add. By the way, just raise your hand and go ahead. All right. Here is a video that I want you guys to actually see. I want you guys to read this. Well, read the captions basically, right? Because I think YouTube provides you with captions now, and just watch the video. So when this is over, you guys can just watch the video as it relates to transatlantic slavery. And here's the triangular trade that we were discussing before. All right. So you guys would have looked at this before. Are there any questions or concerns so far though? Any issues? Anything you guys would like to add? We're just briefly discussing the information.
No, sir.
Everything's good? Okay. Remember, if there's anything to add, you can text in the chat or something you can raise your hand and add. Right? Okay. So we're just briefly discussing the information because a majority of Caribbean studies is reading, right? So I'm here for you guys to like know to facilitate a conversation. So if you're not gonna like discuss anything, then kind of weird, right? But this is just to facilitate the discussion around the information that you guys would have read and understood. Okay. All right. So let's have a look at this. I have also notes to send to you guys. I've sent a plethora of notes already in the group chat, right? So hopefully we can look at that. Now, some of the sociological impacts, right, that we have of enslavement, transatlantic slavery, right? I think we already understand the picture of transatlantic slavery already. We already understand the fact that West Africans were dehumanized. We understand the fact that they had to wake up um in early hours. They worked from morning till dusk, right? Basically from dusk till dawn in a type of sense, right? Or from dawn till dusk in the other direction, right? Most of them worked on the plantation, some of them worked in the house. We're gonna be speaking about how that works specifically, right? So the sociological impact specifically, African slavery began in 1518 in the New World, right? Almost just over 400 years, right? Specifically. With slavery, there is a further pluralization of sociocultural, of the sociocultural Caribbean, right? So what we're talking about specifically, pluralization. What is pluralization? Have you guys spoken about that within the sociological impacts, within sociology, within Caribbean studies? Have you guys looked at that?
We think that pure society, sir.
A plural society, yeah? Mm-hmm. What's a plural society? Does anybody know what a plural society? Go ahead. You know what it is? Plural society.
Basically,
Uh,
Oh,
you could go.
okay, go ahead. Mm, go ahead. On you. All right, go ahead. The person who's raised their hand.
Okay, so for all society, it refers to like communities or society that are characterized by the coexistence of like religious groups and um distinct ethnic something like that with
Mm-hmm.
institutions and their own identities.
Okay. All right. So yeah, that's somewhat what it is, right? So it's the marginalization of different groups within the same society, right? So we had some amount of cultural pluralization, right, within this aspect, right? As different types of cultures mix, right, we tend to have cultural pluralization. And when we talk about the sociological impacts of the West Africans migrating to the Caribbean, right, we have to really look at the demographics as well. Majority of Caribbean colonies were of West African descent because Africans outnumbered Europeans a lot, right? Yet there was still a type of sociological hierarchy existing, right? So just looking at the fact that we have a diverse amount of culture or a diverse culture group within the Caribbean today. But looking at this standpoint, right, we only have Amerindians, Europeans, and West Africans thus far. We haven't looked at the indigenous, well, not the indigenous, the indentured people yet, right? So what we're looking at here is that there was a need for the removal of African identity, right? So there was some amount of cultural erasure for domination, else the Africans would have rebelled. So we look at the subjugation of the West Africans, right, in a way where some people can't understand how you could have a population of 100 million people and 900 million of them are West Africans, yet there's no revolt. There's been no major revolt for over 200 years, right? Go ahead. I want you to say what you see.
Yes, sir, and I think that's the interesting part about slavery because of how much of a mental impact it has on a person because they are more in numbers, and it would tell that would tell us that because them not revolt, being that they are more in numbers, mean that they feel so defeated in a sense where their mental just mess up. So the whites have them on such in such control where even though they are outnumbered, they
Mhm.
still have the upper hand because of how they mentally enslave them.
All right, lovely. All right, so we're looking at the slavery from multiple places, right? It's a multifaceted, right? So slavery is an economic capitalist concept, right? But in order to keep slavery going, right, we had to have some amount of pluralization within society, right? And just looking here, just from the PowerPoint again, right? If we didn't have some amount of cultural erasure, right, the removal of West African culture and the acceptance through acculturation, right, of European ideals, right, then the Africans would have rebelled. All right. So the Europeans went about brainwashing the African people slowly but surely, and in its place putting them in their own pseudo norms and values. And these have major impacts on Caribbean society today, specifically. Right? These have major impacts on Caribbean society today. Right? Today we have what we call cultural renewal. And the examples of cultural renewal in the Caribbean are Garveyism, Rastafari, and other types of movements, right? Things like reggae festivals, things like well that we see in Guyana, right? The Guyanese um government makes different types of efforts to renew some amount of Amerindian identity, right? We're looking at the cultural renewal today, right? And this has to happen today, or this had to happen, right, because of the cultural erasure of a couple hundred years ago, right? So just to remind you guys, slavery is not that far away. 100 years ago, and you're smack dab back into some of the issues, right, that are constantly going on just after emancipation, right? 200 years ago is not that far ago, right? Just keeping that in mind. So these sociological impacts are still here. There are other types of sociological impacts that we could look at, all right? We're looking at stuff like beauty standards. We're looking at male sexuality and female sexuality and gender within the Caribbean, right? We're looking at economic factors within the Caribbean, right? There are multiple different factors that we can look at, right? So what are some of the factors, sociological factors that occurred through slavery that we can still see within the Caribbean today? Can anybody remind me? Anything. Anything that happened in slavery sociologically that we still see happening today. Right? When we're talking about sociologically, we can still see the social institutions, etc. Davian was asking for the definition of pluralization. Can somebody just drop that in the chat? All right. And what my question now is asking, what are the different sociological impacts that you guys can see within contemporary society that occurred because of slavery? So colorism is one of them. All right. So we have colorism. Racism does exist within the Caribbean, and let me just say that lyricism does exist within the Caribbean. It really does. Some Caribbean persons or Caribbean nationals love to say that the Caribbean does not have a racist issue; it has a colorist issue, right? You can't say that Caribbean does not have a racist issue. We still do completely. It's not as potent as colorism, but racism still exists within the Caribbean, right? And most of it is internal, right? That's why we don't really see it, and we kind of dismiss racism. Like we don't understand how racism can exist in the Caribbean. It does, right? The mono approach as it relates to economics. All right. So we have that there. Joel, could you expound on the mono approach to
So
economics?
in slavery, the what happened was that they had one product, sugar. So it's a monoculture approach. We and now have that same approach. How we look at how our economic settings. We look at tourism. Okay, this is the big everything. So we pull all of our resources into that level, or see that as the only, viable or the sustainable way of making money, tourism. So I think that's something we adopted from, the slavery time.
Okay. So within plantocracy, or well, plantation societies, we focus on specifically one type of agricultural product, and majority of the regions across, well, majority of the nations across the Caribbean focus on agricultural societies. Our societies are mainly agricultural, right? The only societies that we can't say are majority agricultural, maybe Barbados, Guyana, and Trinidad. All right, all the other islands make their money through agricultural products or through their natural resources via tourism. All right, no other source of income. If the tourism industry collapsed across the Caribbean, majority of us bankrupt, finished, nation destroyed. Right. So that is something that we don't want to happen. Right. So diversification is important, and diversification is something that we see happening through the peasantry, right? But it's still, some amount of this still occurs still today. Somebody said racism towards whites, that still occurs, right? Cultural inequalities, right? Cultural inequalities did happen, right? So persons who have a more of a European or Eurocentric mindset or look to them tend to be more highly preferred or highly favored over persons who embrace West African or African ideals, right? We have that as well. Plantation stratification doesn't really apply today, though, right? The remnants of it may apply, but it doesn't really apply today because now um, we don't have a locked or a closed system of cultural stratification or social stratification today, right? So it's a little bit more loose. So it's not specifically plantation stratification, right? We can also look at the family system, how it affected the family structure. We can speak about the fact that we had the different types of gender aspects as it relates to the gendering of Caribbean males and what they're meant to be and the ideology of what they are meant to do, and the distinct what would I say now? The distinct need for reproduction and the destruction of actual family systems and this family as a social institution within the Caribbean. We can see the fact that the promiscuity of men within the Caribbean society. We look at the lack of or the defeminization of Caribbean women, right? We could look at some things like that. We could look at the fact that Caribbean societies, within Caribbean societies, we tend to have mostly matrifocal and matrilineal and matriarchal structures, right? Mostly we have patrilineal structures, but we still have matriarchal and matrifocal family structures, right? So we could look at some of those types of sociological impacts, right? And when we start talking about the next topic, so looking at the sociological phenomena within the Caribbean, then we're gonna start talking about syncretic cultures and stuff like that. But slavery had a lot to do with how contemporary Caribbean society and how we view us, right? How we view ourselves today, right? It has a lot of impact on that. Okay. So one other term that we need to know specifically, right, would be the plantocracy, right? So the plantocracy existed in the southern part of America, all way down into Argentina, right? So we're talking about the Western world here, right? So via plantations, new crops like sugarcane, cotton, and oranges became a cultural spectrum that goes on until this day. Except that it's similar to what Joel was saying earlier, right? These are some of the main crops that our countries still cultivate until this specific day. Right? Some crops became synonymous with countries, for example, Cuba and tobacco. Trinidad has world famous um, cacao, right, for chocolate production, etc. Right? So some of these different types of products became synonymous, right? Within the 1950s, 1960s, before the complete collapse of the Jamaican banana industry, right? Jamaica was synonymous with bananas, right? In all sense of the word and connotations of its meaning. Not sure if anybody got that. But Grenada as well as the spice capital of the Western Hemisphere, right? So some of our Caribbean nations are known for these different things based off of the plantocracy and the plantation system that existed, right? Crops became a part of the Caribbean people's identity. Plantations became important to the economies, and the plantation was based upon clearly defined structures and hierarchy and rank, right? So, what are these hierarchies? What are these ranks that we're talking about? This is what we're talking about, the social hierarchy within the Spanish colonies, right? So, just an example using Spanish colonies, it's similar to what we have within British colonies and French colonies, as well as the other types of colonies, right? So we tend to have the persons who are born in Europe being at the highest rung of the ladder, right? So remember, we always had whites, then the coloreds, then the blacks, right? The whites had their specific hierarchical structure. Then the coloreds were divided as well, and the blacks were divided as well. So the whites were divided into persons. The Spanish called them peninsulares, right? So the persons who lived on mainland Europe, right? So the Europeans that would come, right? Those were the highest, right? Especially if they were rich, they were on the top of the ladder, right? Then you'd have the poor whites, right? And then you have the whites that lived within the Caribbean or that were born in the Caribbean. They are known as Creoles, right? Those were the bottom of the barrel, so the whites, right? Then you had the completely different admixtures of colored people. You have what we call mulattoes, we have what we call mestizos, we have zambos, we have different types of mixtures, right? These different persons are defined based off of the percentage of white, indigenous, and West African blood that they had, right? So mulattoes are usually a mix between Caucasian and African, and mestizos are usually a mixture between Caucasian and Indian, right? Indian meaning Amerindian, right? And then beneath those, you would have the Native Americans, right? So the Native Indians, and then on top of all of that, right? You had all of that entire structure, right? Right below them, you would have the the Africans, right? So the Africans were the bottom of the barrel, the least, right? They weren't even people, let's be very honest, right? They were one third of a man. Each African was one third of a man, right? If we remember the history correctly, right? And then the West Africans were divided into house enslaved, artisan enslaved, and field enslaved, right? So if you guys remember those type of stuff, right? The field enslaved were at the bottom of the barrel. So within the entirety of the plantocracy, plantation society, if you are field enslaved, that was it. Okay, so I was speaking about the West African divisions. You had house enslaved, then artisan enslaved, then field enslaved. All right. So house enslaved, those are the persons that worked in the house, right? Usually the maids, usually women were house enslaved, right? And then the artisan enslaved were persons who had skills. So the artisan enslaved were persons who went to different plantations, fixing machines and stuff like that, right? So they had skills, right? They were the engineers, right, specifically. And then beneath that, if you had no skill and you didn't work in the house, that means that you worked in the fields, and the field enslaved were the least, right? Actually, to the plantation owners, the field enslaved were the most important because those persons are actually working with the crops, but sociologically, they were the least, right? They were the most insignificant, right? So we have that there. Everybody's following so far. Everybody fine?
Yes, sir.
All right. So everything should be fine so far. Just going through. Remember, if you have anything to add, you just raise your hand and you go. Okay. So let's have a look at this now. There are easily discernible legacies of the plantation era that persist within the Caribbean today, right? So the settlement and tone patterns, right? That is important. So these are some things that we can see within the Caribbean today, right? So communities and towns continue to be organized based on historical plantation layouts, right? No, majority of the large residential areas that were old, right, within our Caribbean territories, majority of them are parts of old plantations. Majority of the places that you live right now are a part of old plantations and areas in which whites, right, or the enslaved used to live. All right. So we have that there. Large majority of the large areas were remnants of plantations, right? Based on the housing patterns. Monocrop agriculture was an important thing. Many Caribbean nations heavily rely on monocrop agriculture, with crops like sugarcane contributing significantly to the gross national product, the GNP. For instance, sugarcane accounts for approximately 60% of Guyana's GNP until like literally this day, till this day. All right. So these things are still ingrained within Caribbean society. Multi-ethnic and racial society. So the Caribbean is characterized by its diverse population due to historical importation of labor from various parts of the world. Right. So we could speak about stuff like that. Right. The importation of labor from different parts of the world and how it created different types of race politics and racial discrimination among colored people within the Caribbean. Right. So we have that as well. Division within society. So the European divided, um, use the divide and conquer strategy, right? It has left a lasting impact on fostering mistrust and divisions within different groups, right? So Caribbean society up until this day, even though haven't spoke about the indentured laborers yet, right? We have a long history of mistrust between different types of oppressed groups, right? Within the Caribbean, we have a thing where we love to oppress the oppressed, right? We love to oppress the persons who are already oppressed, right? And majority of persons don't really care, right? So we tend to oppress the persons who are being oppressed along with us, right? And then we tend to oppress ourselves or persons from our own group as well, right? So those things like that still persist until this day, all right? In which we will favor everybody else but ourselves, right? So it tends to have a lasting impact, right, on our mentality, right? Any other thing that we can see within Caribbean society still till this day that persists from plantation society?
Sir, did you mention the culture of resistance and revolt?
The culture of resistance and revolts? No. Could you do the honors?
Okay, so I was thinking that until plantation society, the slave reach a point, well, the breaking point, so they begin to resist whether actively or passively. That is seen in Caribbean society now, so through things like protest. For instance, like if the government do something where the people don't like them, start protest, them do all types of things, they go and let us resist or try to resist whatever being imposed on them. And that comes on from slavery, from when the slaves resisted the oppression from the whites.
Okay, I do agree with that somewhat. Okay, I do agree with that 100%, but I think it's not as strong as it was in the past. Caribbean people tend to complain a lot. Yes, right? Tend to complain a lot. We tend to resist a lot, right? That is true. Right? That is 100% true. Do we resist in a way in which it is helpful? No, but we resist anyways, right? So if there's something oppressive being done by our government, unless it's extremely oppressive, right, we don't tend to react in a way in which actually posits any change. We tend to stamp our feet and make a lot of noise, right? And resist anything whatsoever that will change our lifestyle, right? But usually that type of resistance doesn't really affect any change, right? Usually it does in some instances. We've had protests across the Caribbean, and we will look at that within the results of the 1930s, right? Caribbean persons protested so much, they burnt down so many government places, they destroyed so many courthouses that the British had to send aircrafts and destroy aircraft carriers and destroyers into the Caribbean to tame Trinidad, British Guyana, right, and some of the lesser Antilles, right. There has been large resistance culture within the Caribbean, but I think it has simmered down now. All right, go ahead. Somebody raise your hand.
Yes, sir. I was saying that while some protests might not affect change, many have. Like for instance, when the teachers they protest, they went on a strike because I would think strike is a mean of resistance as well.
It
And
is.
when them do that, when the essential workers and those people and like people just go on strike unnatural, you usually invoke, although it's not change we would want, some level of change. And I feel like say no more than ever, people quick to go up on strike. Like any little thing them go up on strike, any little thing them go up on social media, or them go up on a protest or go up on a rant about. So yeah, I agree.
All right, so true. Okay, that's fair. That is fair. That is fair. That is true. The insurrectionary behavior of the Caribbean persons have been carried on through from plantocracy. All right, or the plantation era. Okay. Anything else specifically? We already spoke about some amount of social stratification, right? Persons closer to the European dynamic tend to have more of the opportunities, right? And the reason why I said that that racism is still an issue somewhat within the Caribbean, right? When we speak about different types of areas, right? Let me just call it as is. That person just use the regular language, right? You have what we call uptown and downtown. You have what we call residential areas and ghettos, right? Now, there exist completely different ethnic groups within Caribbean countries, right? There is not only different shades of West African, there are not only different shades of Indian, there are not only different levels of Asian, right, within the Caribbean. You still have white persons living in different Caribbean countries. They are Caribbean, right? No, the percentage of white persons or percentage of persons of different ethnic groups you find within areas characterized as ghettos, right, is minute, close to zero, right? While within the large residential areas or what we describe as uptown, um, they tend to be found in a higher frequency. If you draw a line stretching from what we call as ghetto areas into uptown areas, the increase in the percentage of white, Indian, and Chinese people increased drastically, approaching the higher economic areas and the higher residential areas, right? This is not only racism, right, but this is displayed in colorism and classism, right? So these all affect these systems, right? Classism stems from colorism, which stems from racism, right? So that is the entire thing, right? If persons of a darker color tend to have less opportunities, when you have less opportunities, you have less opportunities for labor. Less opportunities for labor, less money. Then you live in the ghetto. That is how it works. That is how racism works. That is how colorism works, right? So yes, we still do have a slight racist problem within the Caribbean, but colorism tends to be more persistent because, yet again, Caribbean people love to argue within our groups and not actually fix the problem, right? But I want you guys' opinion on that, right? So if you have an opinion on that, just let me know, okay? So we have something like that, right? These different things existing within the Caribbean, okay? So we have this as well, cultural imperialism. We speak about the fact that black inferiority prevails until this day, right? And we're looking at European superiority existing until this day, right? Racial and cultural intolerance, right? We're speaking about the fact that, well, it's basically still the European superiority and African inferiority, right? And the different affect and how this affects social institutions, right? So when we speak about the social structures like language standards, right? We tend to want to use the acrolectual variety of language. You guys have done ComSoS already. You guys hear this time and time again. We tend to use the acrolectual form of language, and we look at sociolinguistics within Module 2 of Communication Studies, and how we view persons who speak differently within the Caribbean, right? And to be very honest, the more African or the more Indian you sound, the less educated you tend to sound to persons within the Caribbean. And that is blatant colorism and racism, right? Race issues still exist within the Caribbean. Dress codes as well, right? You must dress similar to the Europeans in order to get a job. You must dress similar to the Europeans to be deemed as, appropriate, right? Your hairstyles must be close enough to the European ideal to be deemed appropriate as well. Our political and legal systems, right, must be, well, have been influenced by European dynamics, right? So we speak about the Westminster system, we speak about parliamentarism parliamentarism and stuff like that, right? These things are influenced by European dynamics, right? And if our governments are not European enough, they are said to be completely corrupt or completely illegitimate. If we do not have the European standard of democracy and the European standard of presidency and the European standard of parliaments, right, then we are seen as, backwards, right? So we must keep the European standards in order for the metropoles, right, the first world countries to view us as even countries, right? So you have stuff like that. These things still persist because of the type of economic um, social, and racial underdevelopment being done to the Caribbean through the plantation system until now in Caribbean, in contemporary Caribbean society, right? So we're looking at the exertion of power by the Europeans on the Caribbean society, right? So these things still exist today, right? And there are many more things you guys can speak about that existed within plantation society that continue to persist until this day, all right? So let me ask you now, do you think these systems, right, that we discussed before still affect us? All right, you guys have the code. Let me resend the code in the chat. I want to see you guys vote. All right. Does it affect us a little? Because some of the things have been watered down a bit, Does it affect us a little? Does it still have a huge effect? Right? I want to know what you guys think. Okay. Let's log on back using the code. There is a link in the chat. I want to see. Right. So does it still affect us? Giving you guys a moment to think. All right. I noticed that it is actually 2 minutes to the hour. Right. But I'm hoping to just go through and finish. Right. And then call it a night. Okay. All right. So it seems that a lot of persons think that somewhat yes. Okay. So while we're voting on this, what do you guys say? All right. The persons who can talk. What do you say? Anyone? Nobody has an opinion on this? Does it still affect us? All right. It seems like. All right. Seems like nobody wants to speak specifically at this point. All right. So we'll just use the answers here. Okay. So nobody said no. All right. Most persons say somewhat. Yes. All right. So it still affects us in some specific way, right? Majority of what we do is seen through the light of sociological impacts of the plantation society. All right. So let's have a move on. All right. Now, let's look at something a little bit interesting. I want you guys to actually speak about this. I want to hear your conversation. He labels the transatlantic slave trade the most detestable system of oppression and cruelty that ever disgraced a civilized nation. Now, who is this, you may ask? John Huddlestone. John Huddlestone was a European. I think he was British. He was English, specifically, right? And he was one of the persons who worked with the William Wilberforce, right? Um, Not only with the Somerset case, but as an abolitionist in the British Parliament. So this is a statement by an abolitionist, all right? Now, looking at the other side, right, of the years, right, looking at the approach towards the end of transatlantic slavery, what can we say about this, all right? We're looking at the fact that over 400 years of oppression, right, has befallen the persons within the Caribbean, not only of African descent, but of Amerindian descent, right? So tensions would, of course, brood, right? The systems of the plantations, well, the plantation system itself would have gone on, proven itself to be a force. But no, West Africans specifically, right? Persons who are born in the Caribbean, actually the Creoles, the persons who are born in the Caribbean, the African diaspora, now starts to organize themselves in such a way, right, to actually free themselves from the shackles of slavery, right? So this is in part by the movements by the industrialists, well, by the industrialists, right, and the movements by the abolitionists, as well as the laws of Burgos, right? These different types of laws, right? We know what the slaves couldn't do. The slaves could not marry, right? The slaves could not represent themselves in court. The slaves could not read. They were not able to do those types of things, right? Around In the 1600s, 1700s, different laws and policies were introduced in which enslaved persons were now allowed to be, Christianized, right? No, they were allowed to read, right? That was a major error by the Europeans, right? Allowing blacks to read, right? Another thing, they were allowed to, um, with consent, right? But from their masters, they were allowed to marry in some case, right? Punishment was heavily decreased and frowned upon within some areas of the Caribbean, right? And we're seeing that majority of the restrictions of plantation society have been rolled back, right? Have been ameliorated. And these things now allowed for some amount of leeway for emancipation or movement towards emancipation to occur within the Caribbean, right? So we're talking about resistance, we're talking about revolts, we're talking about revolutions, we're talking about rebellions, right? So let's have a look at some of the things that we could speak about. We're gonna speak about the major ones, right? The Haitian Revolution was the most significant uprising in world history, right? Not only in Caribbean history, but in world history. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful rebellion within the Caribbean and within the Western Hemisphere. The only one. Yes, we can talk about Demerara and Berbice. Yes, we can talk about Bosa. Yes, we can talk about the Samshar Rebellion, or the what we call the Christmas Rebellion, right? None of them were even close to succeeding on the level that the Haitian Revolution succeeded, right? Leading to the establishment of the first independent black state, right, within the Western Hemisphere, apart, well, first legalized or professional independent black state within the Western Hemisphere, Haiti, right? Led by enslaved Africans and influenced by figures such as Saint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, right? The revolution resulted in the abolition of slavery and the end of French colonial rule, right? So this is literally the most pivotal revolution in the Caribbean, right? Why am I saying this? This revolution is one of the revolutions that started, right, an entire chain reaction across the world, right? For persons who did Caribbean, well, not Caribbean history, Atlantic history, which is history unit one, right? Um, would have noted that the Haitian Revolution was one of the reasons why the French Revolution in Europe succeeded. And the Haitian Revolution was one of the reasons why the American War of Independence occurred in the way it did, right? With the help of the French, right? It was one of the reasons why there was an uprising in Grenada in the same year. There was one of the reasons why there was an uprising within Barbados after, right? Then on Antigua, then in Dominica, then in Jamaica, right? There are multiple rebellions and revolts that happened because of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was the first and the only sign, right, that the Africans themselves could overthrow white imperialist rule and establish their own fully functioning state within the Caribbean. It was the first sign that slavery was not invincible. And that is one of the reasons why the Haitian Revolution is the most important revolution, I might add, in world history. Right? There are important revolutions in different hemispheres, of the Russian Revolution, etc., the Chinese Communist Revolution, etc. Right? But the Haitian Revolution is the most important revolution, especially in the Western Hemisphere. All right? We have other types of revolutions that we could speak about, such as the Bossa Rebellion of 1816. Right? In Barbados, Bossa, an enslaved African, led a large-scale rebellion against British colonial rule. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed, but it played a gradual role in pushing towards emancipation within Barbados. Right? The Bossa Rebellion, right, it was what one of my history teachers described as the Bullet Rebellion. This rebellion was really, really fast. I think it was within the scope of not even a week passed, not even a couple of days passed, and Barbados was always already all over in turmoil. Right? The Bosa Rebellion was one of the most effective rebellions, right? But it was ultimately suppressed. But I'm just listing out the major rebellions that we can write about and we can somewhat speak to, right? We also have what happened in Demerara and Berbice, Berbice happened way before all of them. So, although predating the end of slavery, the uprising in Guyana in Berbice is noteworthy, right? So, the enslaved Africans rebelled against the Dutch colonial masters that were eventually defeated, right? We also have the Demerara Rebellion here in present-day Guyana. Enslaved Africans staged a rebellion against the Dutch colonies, right? The colonial authority, right? The revolt was brutally suppressed, but it added to the growing resistance against slavery in the region. What happened in Demerara and Berbice ultimately led to it helped, right, to lead to the expulsion of the Dutch from the colony, and for the Dutch to give over the colony to the British, right? The British actually governed the colony a little bit better, right? But we had that there, right? Just listing some of the major rebellions that we have. Okay.
Mhm.
So we also have the Christmas Rebellion. The Christmas Rebellion is the last major rebellion, right? So the Sam Sharp's Rebellion, also known as Christmas Rebellion or the Baptist Wars, was a revolt that took place in Jamaica. Led by the Baptist deacon Sam Sharp, it was one of the largest slave rebellions in the British Caribbean, right? So, although initially suppressed, it contributed to the eventual emancipation of the slaves across the British Empire. So the Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica was the last leg for the British Empire. It was the rebellion that allowed for the British Empire to realize that, hey, we need to find a way to actually get all of this under control, or we're going to lose all of our colonies, right? Under their terms, right? Specifically, right? So what happened within Jamaica, right, is really, really controversial, by the way, right? Because we end up having all sort of stuff that I cannot say on a recording, right? I can speak about it off the recording, by the way. But a lot of controversial stuff happened within the Christmas Rebellion, right? And it ultimately occurred because the British basically called the enslaved within the Caribbean lazy, right? So, they kind of, attack them, right? So it was a part of the other revolts as well. Okay, but the Christmas Rebellion was the last major rebellion in the British Caribbean that led to the complete abolition of slavery across the Caribbean. Remember that it actually started with the apprenticeship system and then full abolition, right? So we have that there. Okay, so it's really something like that. And then we have post-emancipation movements, right? Shouldn't take too long to really go through post-emancipation movements, but can anybody just let me know what happened after emancipation? All right, what happened to the plantocracy? What did the plantocracy do after slavery was abolished? Right, I want you guys to just go straight to the mentee and just give me some concepts. What did they do, or what happened after slavery? Remember, this is just a discussion of the information, and I gave you guys notes, so you guys already have notes. For persons who just joined the WhatsApp group, I'm gonna have to read some notes and stuff. But yeah,
What happened was that they had a labor shortage because slaves were leaving the plantation, so they had to get labor somehow. So they looked to Asia, and that's how indentureship came about.
okay. Indenturedship happened, all right. The plantocracy was severely weakened, The WhatsApp group, I'm gonna resend them, all right. But somebody just asked where the notes are. I'm gonna send them in the WhatsApp group, all right. But yeah, so the indentureship. Anybody, anything else? What did the plantocracy do after slavery was abolished? That was what we did, right? So, and indentureship is the main answer, right? You got new workers. The church gave away land, all right. So we spoke about. You can speak about the different free communities and free villages that were allotted across the islands, right? But these free villages were given by the Baptists, right, across large colonies. Smaller colonies, no, 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 it wasn't going to work, right? For larger colonies, they had a lot of land, right? We have the development of this peasantry as well. Lovely, right? So for large colonies, right, the Baptists actually gave away some land, right? And these lands were far away from the population centers, far away in the hills, right? Um, and we have some names of different types of population centers and different types of free villages, but they weren't actually given for free. They were actually given for a specific price, and they had to work for some amount of money, and that's where the plantocracy come well, not the plantocracy, the peasantry comes in, when they found different types of economic strategies to survive in a post-slavery economy. All right, but the new workers, let's focus on that for the moment. All right,